The town of Havenbrook slept beneath a veil of late autumn fog. It was November of 2005, and the maple trees lining the narrow streets had surrendered their leaves weeks ago. What remained were gray branches clawing against a sky heavy with rain, a silence stretching over the town like a worn blanket. In that silence stood a house on the edge of Maple Street. Its paint chipped, its roof sagging with the years. To the casual eye, it was nothing more than another weary home in a weary town. Yet behind its closed doors, something darker lingered. The Parker residence did not look like a stage for tragedy. A faded swing set rusted in the yard, and Daniel Parker's small bicycle leaned against the porch as if waiting for its rider to return. The windows were drawn tight curtains pressed to the glass, leaving no hint of the life or the shadows inside. Neighbors often said the house was too quiet, unnaturally so. Even when the television was on, even when Richard Hale sat in the living room with his beer bottles scattered around him, a weight seemed to press over the place, stifling every sound. Inside, the air was always stale, carrying the sour trace of alcohol and something more subtle, something metallic. Richard Hale, the stepfather who claimed the house as his throne, drifted through its rooms like a storm contained in human form. His presence lingered in the walls, in the way Elena Parker kept her voice low, in the way Daniel's laughter, once bright, had grown rare. The boy had learned quickly that joy drew attention, and attention invited punishment. Daniel's room was a small sanctuary he tried to protect. Posters of airplanes covered the peeling wallpaper. He loved the idea of flying, of leaving the ground behind, of rising above Havenbrook, above the shouting, above the nights when doors slammed and bottles shattered. Beneath his pillow he kept a sketchbook filled with crude drawings, planes soaring above clouds, a boy with wings stretched wide. They were more than doodles. They were silent prayers. The Parker household was, to the outside world, unremarkable. To those who lived close, it carried whispers. Neighbors spoke of muffled cries at night, of shadows passing the curtained windows, of Elena appearing at the grocery store with eyes rimmed red. Yet, in towns like Havenbrook, whispers were often swallowed by routine. People convinced themselves it was better not to interfere, that family matters belonged behind closed doors. Silence became complicity, and the house remained undisturbed. On the morning of November 12th, the silence grew heavier. Elena moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her hands trembling as she poured coffee she would not drink. Richard was already drunk, his muttering filling the air like static. Daniel was nowhere to be seen, though his school bag sat in the corner untouched. To an unknowing eye, it was simply a troubled household. But for Daniel, locked away beyond the thin walls of the house, time had already begun to collapse into pain. The neighbors, unaware of what was unfolding, went about their lives. A dog barked. A delivery truck rattled past. Havenbrook was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, yet in the most crucial hours, no one truly saw what was happening. And the house at the end of Maple Street kept its secrets, waiting for the moment they would spill into the open. As night returned, fog gathered once more around the Parker residence. The swing outside creaked in the wind, though no child sat upon it. The boy, with the dreams of flying, remained unseen, his wings folded within sketches no one had yet discovered. The house was silent, too silent, and silence in Havenbrook was never without meaning. Morning broke reluctantly over Havenbrook. The fog had thickened, pressing low against rooftops, turning every sound into a muted echo. It was a Saturday, and the streets were emptier than usual. At the edge of Maple Street, the Parker residence sat half-hidden, its windows staring blankly at the gray light. Nothing moved there except the restless swing in the yard, creaking against the wind. At 9 o'clock, Martha Green, the neighbor who had lived 2 doors down for more than 30 years, stepped out with her aging terrier. She had always been observant, though her observations were often wrapped in gossip rather than action. That morning, the terrier tugged at its leash, pulling her toward the Parker house. At first, she resisted, muttering to herself, but the dog whined persistently and strained until she relented. It was then that she noticed something unusual. The shed in the backyard, a squat structure of weathered boards and a rusted padlock, stood ajar. The door swayed gently, revealing a gap wide enough for darkness to seep through. Martha frowned. That shed had always been locked. Richard Hale was obsessive about it. She approached, calling half-heartedly, though she expected no answer. Her dog barked sharply, nose pressed against the ground. Martha stepped closer. The smell reached her first metallic sour, clinging to the air in a way that made her throat tighten. She hesitated, her hand hovering near the door, then pushed it open just a little farther. What she saw silenced her breath and emptied the morning of all sound. Inside, on the dirt floor, lay Daniel Parker. His body was still his face, pale beneath the dim light filtering through a broken slat in the wall. His small frame was marked with bruises, his shirt torn, his arms unnaturally angled. Near him, a leather belt sprawled like a discarded serpent. Dark stains blotched across its length. Martha stumbled back, her scream piercing through the fog, shattering the quiet that had suffocated Maple Street for so long. Within minutes, the police arrived. Patrol cars clustered at the curb, their red and blue lights painting the fog in restless flashes. Officers crossed the yard with grim urgency, voices low, movements sharp. The shed was sealed, cameras raised, evidence bags prepared. Havenbrook, a town accustomed to routine misdemeanors and the occasional bar fight, had never seen anything like this. Inside the Parker house, Richard Hale sat slouched in a chair, a beer bottle sweating in his hand despite the early hour. When officers entered, he barely lifted his eyes. "What's going on?" he muttered, as though the chaos outside were some minor inconvenience. His indifference chilled the room more than anger could have. Elena Parker was found in the kitchen. She clutched the edge of the table, her face, ashen lips trembling but voiceless. Her coffee cup lay overturned, a dark stain spreading across the wood. When told of Daniel, her knees buckled, yet no scream escaped her. The silence she had practiced for years remained her only shield. The house became a hive of activity. Photographs captured every corner, gloves lifted every object, notebooks filled with hurried observations. Yet, in the midst of the procedures, there lingered something heavier, the collective realization that this was not an accident, not a sudden misfortune, but the product of days, perhaps weeks, of hidden cruelty. Outside, neighbors gathered in small knots, whispering, their faces pale. They spoke of nights when they had heard muffled cries, of afternoons when Daniel seemed unusually withdrawn. Each whisper carried a sting of guilt. Why had no one intervened? Why had silence been easier than knocking on a door? As the stretcher carried Daniel away, covered gently with a sheet, the town of Havenbrook felt its breath stolen. The swing in the yard creaked once more in the cold wind, and for the first time every eye on Maple Street turned toward the Parker house, not with curiosity, but with horror. The discovery had torn away the veil, and beneath it lay a darkness that would haunt the town for years to come. The autopsy room was cold, sterile, and humming with the quiet persistence of fluorescent lights. Stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white glow, a stark contrast to the fragile body laid upon the table. Daniel Parker, no longer the boy with wings in his sketchbook, had become the silent witness to his own suffering. His voice was gone, but his body carried a story written in bruises, welts, and wounds. Dr. Mary Ann Keller, the county's chief medical examiner, adjusted her gloves with deliberate care. She had worked through decades of cases, had seen tragedies carved into flesh and bone, yet nothing prepared her for the sheer scale of what Daniel's body carried. Every mark was an accusation, each injury a timeline etched into skin. She inhaled, steadied herself, and began. The first incision revealed more than organs. It revealed the hours, the days of torment. Bruises of varying colors painted Daniel's torso, some fresh and violent purple, others yellowing with age. They told of repeated blows, not a single outburst of rage, but a pattern of punishment extending across time. The belt buckle had left its signature 2 rectangular imprints across his back, shoulders, and legs. Dr. Keller's notes became a grim litany. Contusions, abrasions, lacerations. Over 100 distinct injuries catalogued with precision. Some wounds bore signs of healing, as if Daniel's body had struggled to mend even while more pain was delivered. This was no momentary lapse, no accidental strike. This was systematic, deliberate, and unrelenting. The cause of death ultimately was revealed in the head trauma. A blunt force strike had fractured the fragile bones of Daniel's skull, swelling his brain, pressing life out of him. But as Dr. Keller studied the injuries, she whispered softly to herself, though no one else was there to hear, that the real cause of death was cruelty. His wrists carried faint abrasions, marks of restraint, perhaps rope or the buckle of that belt. His fingernails were chipped, embedded with traces of dirt from the shed floor, as though he had tried to claw his way out of captivity. His lips were cracked, his body dehydrated, pointing to hours left without water. His small stomach was nearly empty, the faint traces of bread, his last meal. It was in the details that the horror deepened. The boy had not only been struck, he had been confined, deprived, broken down. His suffering had been prolonged, drawn out with a precision that revealed not chaos, but control. When the autopsy concluded, Dr. Keller removed her gloves with a heaviness she could not shake. Her report would be clinical, stripped of emotion, filled with measurements and terminology. But inside, she carried the weight of what she had seen. She would remember the smallness of Daniel's frame, the quiet dignity of his silence, the way even in death his hand seemed to reach toward something beyond the table, toward flight, toward escape. The report, once finalized, left no room for doubt. Daniel Parker had endured at least 72 hours of escalating abuse before his body gave out. His death was the final chapter in a cycle of violence that had begun long before. The belt found beside him was no accident, no misplacement. It was the weapon, the instrument of domination wielded by the one person meant to protect and provide. As copies of the autopsy report were sealed and delivered to investigators, the case shifted from suspicion to certainty. Richard Hale was no longer just the shadow of a possibility. He was the focus of every eye, the embodiment of guilt carved into Daniel's broken body. And yet, even with the report in hand, one truth unsettled everyone who touched the file. This boy's cries had been heard, faintly muffled, ignored. The town, the neighbors, the mother each had played a part in the silence that allowed his suffering to stretch into days. The autopsy spoke in a voice of science, but its echo was moral silence can kill as surely as any weapon. Richard Hale was not a man easily forgotten once seen. He carried with him an air of bulk and stubbornness, a presence that filled a room whether he spoke or not. His shoulders sloped with the weight of years spent in menial labor, though in recent times he worked little, preferring the company of bottles lined like trophies across the living room table. His eyes were a dull gray, the kind that revealed nothing and cared for even less. To the neighbors of Havenbrook, Richard was known as the man who had married Elena Parker after she lost her first husband. At first, he was received with cautious goodwill. People said Elena deserved stability, a partner to share the burdens of raising her young son. Richard had seemed quiet, reserved, perhaps shy, but Havenbrook was small, and small towns are observant. It did not take long for the whispers to begin. The whispers told of raised voices late at night, of objects breaking, of Elena arriving at church with faint bruises she insisted were clumsiness. They spoke of Richard's drinking, the way he spent hours at the bar downtown, returning home with a simmering rage that demanded release. No one confronted him directly. Richard was the kind of man who discouraged confrontation, who stared a second too long, whose silence carried the threat of violence. Beneath his rough exterior lay a history that few knew in detail. Richard had grown up in a farmhouse outside the county under the hand of a father known for his cruelty. There were stories of Richard being locked in sheds himself, left in the cold, for minor missteps, whipped with the same belt he would later turn against Daniel. Abuse had been his inheritance, a twisted legacy passed from father to son. In Richard's mind, discipline and pain were intertwined, indistinguishable. But Richard was not merely a product of his past. He was also a man who chose his silence, who never sought help, who clung to anger as though it were the only possession he had left. Alcohol fed the fire, erasing what little restraint remained. To the outside world, he claimed the title of stepfather. Inside the house, he claimed dominion. Elena, quiet and tentative, became the perfect foil for his tyranny. She rarely challenged him, not out of agreement, but out of fear. Her silence created space for his authority, and he used that space to expand. The house bent to his mood. When Richard was calm, there was uneasy quiet. When he was angry, the walls shook with his fury, and Daniel bore the brunt of it. Daniel, with his thin frame and searching eyes, became the target Richard could control. Richard despised weakness, or what he perceived as weakness, and in the boy he saw a reflection of his own powerless youth. Every strike of the belt, every harsh word, was both punishment and projection, a twisted attempt to master the ghost of his father by inflicting the same suffering on another child. To those who tried to interact with him outside, Richard was curt, unyielding. He spoke little, listened less. At the local bar, he was known for nursing his drinks in silence, exploding only when provoked. There were no friendships, only acquaintances who learned quickly to avoid him. He carried an invisible boundary around himself, a territory marked by hostility. The portrait that emerged was one of a man built of bitterness. Richard Hale was not a mystery. He was a pattern repeating itself with grim predictability. Yet, patterns once recognized can be stopped. Havenbrook, however, had not stopped him. Neighbors looked away. Elena kept her head down. And Daniel, trapped in the orbit of Richard's rage, became another link in the chain of silence. Richard's story was not an excuse. It was an explanation, one that deepened the horror rather than softened it. For in the end, knowing how a man becomes a monster does not undo the harm he commits. It only reveals how easily cruelty survives when left unchallenged. Elena Parker moved through her days like a figure sketched in faint pencil, always present but never fully defined. To those who knew her before Richard Hale entered her life, she had been a woman of soft laughter, a widow who carried her grief with quiet dignity while raising her young son. She was not exuberant, but she was steady. The sort of neighbor who remembered birthdays, who brought casseroles to the sick, who held Daniel's hand with a protective warmth. But after Richard, her presence dimmed. Her voice, once gentle but clear, became subdued, as if each word carried a risk. She answered questions in short replies, her eyes darting toward the man beside her, gauging his mood before she spoke. The Elena of old slipped further from sight, replaced by a version trained to survive in silence. Inside the house, she learned the rhythms of Richard's temper, the way others might learn the patterns of weather. She could sense the storm before it broke, the way his jaw tightened the slump of his shoulders when drink had soaked too deep the sudden stillness that came before the outburst. In those moments, she gathered herself into invisibility, hoping the fury would pass over her. Too often, it did not. And when it shifted toward Daniel, she felt her stomach twist with guilt, yet her feet remained rooted. Elena was not blind to what was happening to her son. She saw the bruises, the withdrawn glances, the way he clutched his sketchbook like a lifeline. She heard the muffled cries at night, her hand hovering over the doorknob while her heart pounded with dread. But every time, fear spoke louder than courage. She told herself that intervening would only make Richard angrier, that Daniel would suffer more if she tried to stop it. The lie became a shield she used to justify her paralysis. There were nights when she wept silently, curled in bed, whispering apologies Daniel could not hear. In the dim light of early morning, she wiped her eyes, painted on a semblance of composure, and prepared breakfast as if routine could mend what terror had broken. Her silence became ritual, her complicity woven into the fabric of survival. To the neighbors, she was a ghost of herself. Martha Green recalled seeing her at the grocery store, eyes rimmed red, fumbling for words when asked how she was. Others remembered her excuses: Daniel had fallen, she had tripped on the stairs, the house was drafty, and she hadn't slept. No one pressed harder. They accepted her silence because it was easier than probing the truth it concealed. Elena's silence was not only fear, but also isolation. Richard had cut her off from friends, discouraged visits, belittled her until she believed she was incapable of standing alone. Each insult became a brick in the wall he built around her, and within that prison she convinced herself she had no choice. Yet, somewhere inside, the mother remained. She saw Daniel's drawings, his paper wings, his longing for escape. She folded those sketches carefully when she found them, as if by preserving them she could preserve a part of him untouched by cruelty. She whispered promises into the quiet of his room. Promises she lacked the strength to keep that. Someday it would be different, that someday they would leave. When the day came that Daniel was carried out of the shed beneath a white sheet, Elena's silence collapsed into a void. The weight of her unspoken words, the moment she had stood frozen when she might have acted, bore down with crushing force. She realized that silence, her chosen weapon of survival, had also been the weapon that betrayed her son. Her story was not one of malice, but of fear, and yet fear had proven just as deadly. In Havenbrook, her silence would be remembered not as protection, but as absence, the absence of a mother's voice when it was needed most. The case against Richard Hale seemed at first like a puzzle with pieces already falling into place. The autopsy confirmed prolonged abuse. The belt found beside Daniel's body matched the injuries etched into his skin. The neighbors whispered of shouts of shadows in the Parker house, and Richard himself, with his hollow indifference, appeared almost eager to accept the role of villain. Yet, investigations are rarely so neat. Truth, when it surfaces, often carries complications. Detectives combed the shed with meticulous care. Dust fibers, splinters of wood, all were catalogued. In the midst of this routine work, a small discovery shifted the course of suspicion. On the blood-stained belt, already identified as the likely weapon, technicians lifted a partial fingerprint. At first, it was expected to belong to Richard, but when compared against his records, the ridges did not align. The print belonged to someone else. The finding rippled through the investigation like a stone dropped in still water. A second person had touched the belt, but who and when? The prosecutors prepared their case with the autopsy report as centerpiece, yet this new detail hung in the air, demanding explanation. Defense attorneys seized upon it instantly. In the sterile light of the courtroom, they would argue the presence of an unidentified fingerprint cast doubt. Perhaps another hand had guided the violence. Perhaps Richard was not the only shadow in the Parker household. The discovery unsettled the detectives as much as it intrigued them. They revisited every angle, every timeline. Could someone else have entered the Parker home? Was there an intruder, as Richard weakly suggested in his first muttered defense? The notion seemed absurd, yet the fingerprint remained stubborn in its presence, refusing to vanish into easy explanation. Neighbors were questioned again, their accounts scrutinized for inconsistencies. None recalled strangers near the house. The only figures ever glimpsed were Elena pale and quiet, Daniel withdrawn, and Richard brooding like a storm cloud. No one spoke of visitors, no sign of forced entry was found. The house was a fortress of secrets, its doors closed to the world. Still, the fingerprint lingered like a whisper someone else had been close to Daniel's suffering. The shed, once a chamber of silence, now echoed with a question that unsettled everyone who entered. For Elena, the discovery was another weight pressing on her chest. She sat in the corner of the police station during questioning, hands clenched in her lap, eyes unfocused. She knew the belt. She had seen it countless times lifted and swung with fury. She knew, too, how her own hands had once grasped it in desperation, trying to stop the blows. The memory clawed at her, but fear sealed her lips. To speak now would be to expose her complicity, her failure to protect Daniel. So she said nothing, even as the walls closed in. The community, hearing fragments of rumor, stirred uneasily. If Richard was guilty as they believed, who, then, was the other presence implied by the fingerprint? The gossip circled with renewed fervor, each speculation more desperate than the last. The case no longer felt like an open and shut condemnation. Instead, it had become a story of shadows, of uncertainties. The neat portrait of a cruel stepfather unraveled, replaced by a darker suggestion that Havenbrook had overlooked not only Richard's violence but perhaps another layer of silence woven into the tragedy. For the investigators, the fingerprint was both obstacle and omen. It delayed certainty, fractured the narrative, and hinted at truths yet untold. For the town, it ignited unease. And for Elena, it was the beginning of a reckoning she could no longer avoid. In that moment, the story of Daniel Parker shifted. It was no longer simply the tale of a boy and his brutal stepfather. It had become a mystery with an unseen participant, a phantom touch that threatened to rewrite everything they thought they knew. Winter settled heavily over Havenbrook when the trial of Richard Hale opened. Snow clung to the courthouse steps, muffling the sound of hurried boots. Inside, the courtroom carried an air of restrained unease, its wooden benches filled with townsfolk who had come not merely to witness justice but to confront their own silence reflected in the tragedy of a child. Richard sat at the defense table. His broad frame slouched, his expression unreadable. He wore a suit borrowed from the county jail's collection, the fabric hanging awkwardly from his shoulders. He seemed neither nervous nor repentant, only irritated at the inconvenience. Elena Parker sat several rows behind, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She looked as though she might vanish into the wood of the bench itself. The prosecution began with the facts that carried weight no defense could easily shake. Photographs projected onto the wall showed Daniel's bruises, each mark catalogued and dated by Dr. Marianne Keller. Her testimony was calm, clinical, but devastating. She recited the list of injuries like a grim inventory, a body turned into evidence. The jurors shifted in their seats, some averting their eyes, others staring with a grim determination to bear witness. The belt was introduced as Exhibit A. Its leather was stiff, its buckle jagged with rust and blood. It lay encased in clear plastic, but the horror it symbolized was naked and raw. Dr. Keller's analysis matched its shape to the welts on Daniel's skin. To the prosecution, the weapon was as plain as the crime itself. Richard Hale had wielded it with relentless cruelty. Yet the defense was patient. They did not deny the presence of violence, nor did they contest the severity of Daniel's suffering. Instead, they laid their foundation upon the fingerprint. A single, partial impression lifted from the belt belonging to someone other than Richard. Their argument unfolded slowly, methodically. If this was truly an open and shut case, they asked why was there evidence of another hand? Could another figure have been involved? Could the abuse have come not solely from Richard, but from an unseen accomplice? Their tone was not of certainty, but of suggestion, planting seeds of doubt in the fertile soil of jurors' minds. For the townsfolk, the mention of another hand struck like a whispered rumor gaining form. Murmurs spread through the gallery. Had they missed something? Was there a second shadow in Havenbrook hiding behind the tragedy? The prosecution pushed back, insisting that the fingerprint was incidental, a trace perhaps left by Elena in the chaos of the home or by another household member handling the belt at some earlier time. But the defense clung to it with iron grip, spinning uncertainty into their strongest weapon. Richard, for his part, showed no visible reaction. He neither defended himself nor displayed remorse. When the belt was held aloft, he glanced at it with disinterest, as if it were no more significant than a broken tool. His indifference unsettled even his own attorney, but it served to deepen the mystery for the jury. Was this the cold detachment of guilt, or of a man wrongly accused? Elena sat rigid, every mention of the fingerprint pulling at her like a tightening noose. She alone knew the truth of its origin, knew the night when her desperate hands had snatched at the belt, leaving behind the evidence now weaponized in court. Her silence grew heavier with every passing day, her guilt swelling until it pressed against her chest like a stone. The trial had only just begun, yet already it had diverged from the neat path expected. Instead of a straightforward march toward conviction, it became a labyrinth of doubt, each twist pulling the community deeper into uncertainty. For Havenbrook, the courtroom was not only a stage for justice, but a mirror. The question lingered above every bowed head: if Richard Hale was guilty, who else had failed Daniel Parker? The trial moved forward, with the slow gravity of ritual. Witness after witness took the stand, each layering detail upon detail, weaving the tapestry of Daniel's final days. Yet, beneath the rhythm of testimony, a tension coiled, unspoken but felt by everyone in the room. The fingerprint, small, partial, unexplained, remained the thread that refused to be cut. Elena Parker sat through it all like a shadow. She listened to the sterile language of the autopsy, the clinical certainty of science. She watched photographs of her son projected for strangers to judge his body reduced to evidence. Each image struck her with silent violence. And through it all, the belt appeared again and again, lifted in gloved hands, shown to the jury, dissected as though it were the very language of truth. It was in the fourth week of proceedings that the defense called her to the stand. The room shifted as she rose. Whispers rustled through the gallery, curiosity sharpening into anticipation. Elena walked slowly, as if every step toward the witness chair pulled her deeper into a place she had avoided for years. She swore her oath in a voice that trembled, then sat folding her hands in her lap like a child awaiting reprimand. The defense attorney guided her gently at first, asking about her life with Richard, about the household, about Daniel. Her answers were quiet, almost inaudible, but the silence of the courtroom carried them. Yes, Richard drank. Yes, he shouted. Yes, Daniel had seemed withdrawn. Her words floated like fragments too thin to shield her from what would come next. Finally, the attorney placed the belt upon the table before her. Encased in its plastic sheath, it seemed to radiate menace even from a distance. The lawyer's voice was steady. "Mrs. Parker, do you recognize this object?" Elena's eyes lingered on it too long. She nodded faintly, and then pressed, with the question everyone had waited for, she broke. Tears blurred her vision, her voice cracked open, and words poured out that she had carried in silence for years. "Yes," she whispered, the sound raw. "I touched it. The fingerprint. It's mine." The air in the courtroom fractured. Gasps rippled through the benches. Jurors leaned forward, eyes wide. The defense, caught off guard by the intensity of her confession, fell silent. Elena continued her words, trembling but unstoppable now, as though once released they could not be contained. She told them how she had tried one night to pull the belt from Richard's hands as he raised it against Daniel. How her fingers had clutched the leather, desperate to protect her child, leaving behind the print that now stood as a question mark in the trial. How she had failed, how her strength had faltered, and she had let go. Her confession was not merely about the fingerprint. It was about the silence that followed the countless nights when she stood outside Daniel's room and did nothing, when fear held her tongue and guilt bound her hands. She spoke of the apologies whispered into the dark, of the promises she never kept, of the way she had watched her son shrink beneath the weight of cruelty. By the time her voice gave way to sobs, the courtroom was transfixed. The fingerprint was no longer a mystery of intrusion, but a symbol of complicity, proof that she had been there, had tried, and had surrendered. The defense's weapon had turned into an indictment of silence. Richard Hale did not flinch. He stared forward, unmoved, as though her confession was no more significant than a change in weather. But for the jury, for the townsfolk packed into the benches, the revelation was seismic. The case was no longer just about the brutality of one man. It was about the paralysis of another, about a mother's voice too long restrained, about a community that had turned its eyes away. When Elena stepped down, she carried no relief. Confession had not freed her, it had only laid bare the truth she would carry forever. But in that moment the narrative shifted irrevocably. The trial was no longer about doubt. It was about judgment, not only of Richard Hale, but of silence itself. The final week of the trial arrived with the solemnity of winter's deepest chill. Outside the courthouse, the snow had hardened into brittle sheets of ice, crunching beneath the boots of those who gathered to witness the conclusion. Havenbrook was a town that rarely saw its courthouse filled to capacity. But on that morning, every seat was taken. The weight of judgment pressed on more than the man seated at the defense table. It pressed on the town itself. Richard Hale sat motionless, his heavy frame leaning back as though the proceedings were an inconvenience he intended to outlast. His face betrayed nothing. Not anger, not regret, not fear. Elena Parker sat behind him. Her shoulders hunched, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her confession lingered in the minds of everyone present, a wound opened and left raw. The prosecution's closing statement was measured, deliberate, unyielding. They painted a picture of cruelty sustained over days, a pattern that could not be mistaken for accident or loss of control. Daniel Parker's body bore more than wounds. It bore testimony. Every bruise, every abrasion was a voice speaking for a child who could not. They reminded the jury that Richard Hale had not acted in a single moment of rage, but had constructed a cycle of torment that ended only when Daniel's body could endure no more. The defense, cornered by Elena's confession, shifted tactics. They spoke of Richard's past, of his own childhood under an abusive father, suggesting that cruelty had been inherited rather than chosen. They asked the jury to consider whether a man shaped by violence could be fully accountable for repeating what he had known. It was not a plea for innocence, but for mercy. Yet the words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. The jurors had seen Daniel's photographs. They had heard the autopsy. They had felt the silence of Elena's voice when it broke into confession. Mercy was scarce in that room. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict carried the finality of a gavel before it was even spoken. Guilty of murder in the first degree, of aggravated child abuse, of every charge laid before him. Richard did not react. He simply stared ahead as if the word had no meaning, as if judgment itself were a language he refused to learn. For the first time in weeks, Elena lifted her eyes. Tears filled them, but they did not fall. She had expected the verdict, but the sound of it spoken aloud pierced her deeper than she had imagined. It was not relief she felt, but an ache that nothing could undo. When the judge pronounced sentence life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the air in the courtroom shifted. Some gasped quietly, others exhaled in grim satisfaction. Justice had been served, the court declared. Yet justice in Havenbrook did not feel like triumph. It felt like a funeral. Outside, the townsfolk spilled into the cold air, their breaths rising in clouds of silence. Conversations were hushed, uneasy. For though Richard Hale had been condemned, the echoes of his violence lingered in the streets, in the guilt of neighbors who had heard but not acted, in the whispers of teachers who had seen but not spoken, in the heart of a mother whose silence had carried a cost too great to bear. The judgment was not confined to Richard alone. It was carried home by every person who had watched from the benches, who now returned to their kitchens and living rooms with a sharpened awareness of how easily cruelty could hide behind curtains. Daniel Parker would never fly as he dreamed. His sketchbook, retrieved from his room, remained as the only testament to his hope. But in Havenbrook his story would not be forgotten. The trial had closed with a verdict, but the true sentence was one the community would serve for years, the burden of remembering and the duty to never again remain silent. The trial ended the verdict delivered, and yet the town of Havenbrook could not simply return to its quiet routines. Silence, once a comfort, had turned into a haunting reminder of complicity. The Parker house stood abandoned, its windows shuttered, its swing set creaking in the cold wind. Snow collected on the roof and porch, blanketing the home as though to conceal its history. But memories have no doors to shut, no curtains to draw. They linger. In the weeks that followed, the community searched for ways to make sense of the tragedy. A memorial was placed outside Daniel's school, flowers, candles, photographs, small paper airplanes folded by his classmates. Each offering was a gesture of sorrow, an attempt to give back the voice that had been stolen from him. Teachers recalled the boy with the quiet smile, the child who loved to draw planes on the corners of his notebooks. They spoke of how he had once said in a rare moment of candor that he wanted to fly away from everything. It was there, among his belongings, that the most poignant discovery was made. In his sketchbook, creases bent, pages smudged, lay a drawing that had gone unnoticed until after his death. A boy stood with wings stretching across the page, crude yet hopeful lines forming feathers that seemed ready to lift him skyward. Beneath the figure, scrawled in uneven letters, were the words, "I want to fly." The drawing became more than a child's fantasy. It became the emblem of a town's grief and its resolve. The school framed a copy of the sketch and placed it in the main hallway. Parents stopped to look at it, their children tugging at their hands. Teachers pointed to it, reminding students not only of Daniel's dreams, but also of the responsibility they all shared to listen when a child's silence speaks louder than words. For Elena Parker, the epilogue of the trial was not closure, but a sentence of her own. She lived with the weight of confession, the knowledge that she had been present in the darkest hours yet had lacked the strength to stop them. Her silence had carved its own wound, one she carried into every waking moment. She entered counseling, but therapy could not erase the echoes of her son's cries. Redemption, if it existed, would be lifelong and incomplete. Richard Hale disappeared into the vast machinery of the prison system, another number in an endless ledger, but even there, his name carried shadows. He had become a symbol in Havenbrook of what cruelty looks like when left unchallenged. People spoke his name less and less, as though saying it aloud risked summoning the very darkness they sought to forget. The town itself changed. Laws and procedures tightened. Teachers were trained to recognize signs of abuse more sharply. Neighbors, once content to mind their own affairs, began to knock on doors to ask questions, to risk discomfort for the sake of safety. Havenbrook learned through grief that silence was not neutrality but a choice, and often the deadliest one. In the years that followed, each anniversary of Daniel's death was marked by a gathering. Children released paper airplanes into the sky, their paths erratic, some soaring, some tumbling, yet all rising for a moment into the air Daniel had once dreamed of reaching. Adults stood quietly watching, their breaths visible in the winter chill, each paper plane a fragile promise that his suffering would not be in vain. As the planes drifted upward, the town remembered not only the horror of his final days, but also the resilience of his hope. Daniel Parker's wings, drawn in pencil, had become real in the hearts of those who vowed to listen, to speak, to act. And in the stillness after the airplanes vanished from sight, a quiet voice seemed to echo through Havenbrook's cold air, a reminder, soft yet enduring: never again.